Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We're ready to jump into another game week here in Happy Valley following Penn State's second bye week of the season. It's stepping aside for a Saturday. We are looking forward to a matchup in Madison this Saturday. Night game, prime time out of Wisconsin. The number 3 Nittany Lions will face their latest test in Big Ten play. And then I got the big one after that one. We now know it's going to be a noon kickoff between Ohio State and Penn State in Beaver Stadium on November 2nd. That word officially coming our way here on Monday afternoon, fresh out of a James Franklin Beaver Stadium press conference. We took a pause from that last week during the bye week, but that's where we'll be every Monday for the remainder of this regular season. And as always, I was alongside Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallant, who join me now on the Lions247 Podcast. Fellows, hope you had a good bye week, a good Saturday away from covering Penn State football. Just so people know, my voice lost it for a couple days. I think I found it, but it's a little bit sketchy right now. So it sounds a bit different than normal. That's what's going on my end. Daniel, Mark, happy to have you back on board. And Daniel, will begin with the fact that we've got Wisconsin on the radar. We've got a really interesting Big Ten matchup. The Badgers are riding a 3-game win streak. Penn State's still at number 3 nationally after some movement in the top 25 near the top. And yet again, will be viewed as a key stepping stone for this Nittany Lions squad to get where they want to be.
Definitely. I think that as you move forward, the stakes continue to go up. And with every game as the season gets shorter and some of these bigger games like this Ohio State game getting closer, the implications become more and more obvious, I think. You know, this morning I had to Google when the first college football playoff rankings come out. That'll be 2 weeks from Tuesday. On
November something else 5th. Happening that day?
It's the most important thing on the calendar.
Yeah, the most important committee a meeting at one point. But yeah, so we're getting to that time of year. And so I think with Penn State, it becomes really narrowing down. We know that James Franklin likes to preach his 1-0 mentality, but I think at this point, when you start getting into the implications of single thing that happens, that becomes even more and more important. And so Wisconsin is up next. I know that there's a lot of Ohio State chatter right now, you know, because of how people feel about Big Noon in one way or the other, but it's Wisconsin next Saturday night in Madison.
And we'll have a chance to talk about that Ohio State matchup a lot moving forward. But I think we owe it to this one to focus in on Wisconsin versus Penn State over the course of this week. We will break down the Badgers on our next episode of this podcast with a Wisconsin insider, talk about the keys to their 3-game win streak, what they're bringing to the field at 5-2. But Mark, as I discussed, you know, we're stepping aside on a Saturday from watching this team play, but there's action all across America. The number 1 team in the country, by many people's opinion, goes down on home turf against Georgia. They fall to number 5. That was the Texas Longhorns in the AP Top 25 poll. Ohio State's number 4, Penn State number 3, Georgia number 2, and Oregon is number 1 in the nation. It's the company that Penn State would like to keep all the way to the finish line when the college football playoff conversation comes out. But we're a couple weeks away, as Daniel mentioned, from learning Penn State's initial fate in those rankings. What do you make early on of the way this matchup gives the Nittany Lions a chance to build their case, and the 3 straight wins for the Badgers? Does that change in any way how you're viewing this matchup?
First of all, Penn State is in take care of business mode right now. They should not, if they're worrying about Ohio State, they're going to be in trouble. And I don't think they will be. One thing we've seen from James Franklin is they've typically not looked past opponents. But you're in a spot now, I think if you look across the country, that even if you lose that Ohio State game, you're still going to be right there competing, you know, up for a top 5 spot. So they have to take care of business in all the rest of these games that they're going to be favored in. I mean, that to me is first and foremost. Again, you could lose to Ohio State. Not saying if you're a fan, you want to see your team lose, but we've seen Ohio State lose and move up. We've seen Georgia lose and now actually, you know, beats Texas and then moves over Penn State. So you talked about it, Tyler. You have this group of opponents you have to that you're up there with, and you just have to be able to take care of business with everybody else. With respect to this team, it's really hard to figure out what Wisconsin's all about, because you look at their Big Ten schedule, and the teams that have beaten are a collective 2-10 in the conference. And even if you add USC, the team they lost to, 4-13 in the conference. So they have not played the caliber of opponents some other teams have played. You know, you look at Penn State's schedule, I think that Illinois game is looking better and better and better. We're going to get another good feel for how good Illinois is this week when they're out at Oregon. But again, it comes down to taking care of business. This is a team, a little surprised Penn State's only a 6.5 point favorite. But I think this is one of those games you better go out there, forget about the slow starts, play well, and take care of business.
7:30 on Saturday night, Wisconsin coming off victory over Northwestern. They beat Northwestern, Rutgers, and Purdue during their 3-game win streak, coming off of back-to-back losses at USC, and before that falling at home against Alabama by 32 points earlier in the year, beat Western Michigan and South Dakota. So very much a major step for this Wisconsin program as well, coming our way on Saturday. We'll talk about that matchup a little bit later. And if you missed it during the bye week, we had Josh Pate on our most recent episode, had a really good discussion about where the Big Ten is at midseason. That's evolved a little bit because we've got another slate of games that have happened since then. But Penn State's still 6-0 like they were when we talked to Josh. So a lot of that is going to hold true into a new week. So if you missed that conversation, we dropped last Thursday with Josh Pate. Check that out. We also added some context from our conversation with Andy Kotelnicki, Penn State's offensive coordinator, during the bye week. When we look at this matchup, Daniel, James Franklin was very complimentary, as he typically is, about the opposing team. He said he noted that Wisconsin has played their best football lately. He called them a hard and a clean team. But when we look at what he said about his own squad, there wasn't really, I would say, a lot of headline-grabbing conversation coming out of the bye week, but I think you can probably work your way toward KJ Winston pretty quickly if you're just reviewing the transcript and saying, well, what did we learn from the answer there from James Franklin? I don't know that we learned much, but still not getting the warm and fuzzies that KJ Winston is getting any closer to resurfacing as a Penn State football player. Daniel, he was asked directly if KJ Winston was expected to play again this season. James Franklin then went and said, we talked about it being long-term, going to leave it at that. He's focused on getting healthy. And that's kind of where the conversation was pinned, at least at this particular point in time.
Yeah, it was an open-ended question that Franklin could have taken in pretty much any direction. I think that he wanted to, where, he always says, I'm not going to talk about injuries, but if you give him some runway, sometimes he'll help you out a little bit there. And, he just stuck to the long term. He did say that he met with Winston and Winston's family, with Anthony Poindexter during the bye, and that, they want to see down the road more leadership from Winston in that safety group. But I think for now, it's very much like when James Franklin says long term, you measure that in months and not in weeks or days. And at this point, it's not even been like a month and a half since that injury. So that's how I've been viewing it. If we could get any sort of information that Franklin would like to volunteer about it is very welcome. But I think that he's really set up the structure in terms of how he talks about injuries, what it means, and that's just kind of I think where we are. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think the last time we saw KJ Winston on the field as a participant was that Bowling Green matchup before the first bye week, and then he was with the team when they came out of the bye week on the field, but not in uniform. And I think pretty soon after that Kent State matchup, or right before the Kent State matchup in mid-September, is when James Franklin gave us the long-term label. As you said, Daniel, I think we're 5 weeks out since then. And we'll let people know if there's something to know. But as of right now, the star safety remains kind of the sideline, out of sight, out of mind a little bit for as we discuss this defense. And that brings up Jalen Reed again, Mark. And it feels like the second half of the sentence has been, with KJ Winston out, Jalen Reed needs to step up, ... And we'd love for him to step up at the second level and play that line position if Day Lane allows and that development allows. And it's really been, it feels like a 5-week stretch here, Mark, where that it's been correlated. Can Jalen Reed get back to that line role? Can he play a bunch in that box to the second level in a hybrid position where they think he's going to flourish? And he has flourished at times. But can Day Lane, the freshman at the back end, do his part to convince Penn State's defensive staff that he's ready to be placed back there with Zackie Wheatley full time essentially. And to this point, I think the snap counts have reflected they're not there with Lane yet. He played quite a bit in the UCLA game, but he was under 10 snaps in both the Illinois matchup and the USC matchup, which were contentious contests down into the fourth quarter. So kind of feels like more of the same there too, Mark.
Yeah, I wonder if that bye week wasn't a great thing for Day-Day Lane in terms of being able to just kind of take a step back and absorb. Look at what you put on film, especially in that UCLA game, because that game really wasn't as tight as the score really indicated. Now you get into a game against USC, that's a dogfight, and that's why he's not playing nearly as much. But I think being able to take a step back, examine what you've gone through. This has to be like a whirlwind for this kid because he just showed up in the summer. I mean, this isn't a mid-year enrollee. So for a kid to show up in the summer and be thrust into this kind of role, I think this bye week came at an ideal time for him.
Yeah, we heard a little bit more from Tom Allen on Day-Day Lane too. We'll talk about some takeaways from a bye week conversation with Tom Allen in a moment. But another freshman that came up because I asked about him during the press conference today is Quentin Martin Jr. Wondered if James Franklin was ready to let us know that he's into green light territory because he got in for just a couple offensive snaps. He had a little special teams work at USC. But Daniel, that's 3 game appearances through the first 6 contests, which means you can only play him in one of the next 6 if you're open to preserve his redshirt status going into 2025. Now, I find this pretty interesting because Jaywan Sider took over the running back's job in 2018. He did not burn a single red shirt in that running back room among scholarship freshmen until last year. He did it twice last year with Cam Wallace and London Montgomery. But it sure sounds now at midseason with James Franklin saying they're in yellow light territory right now with Quentin Martin, and then bringing up the fact that maybe Corey Smith, and he's done this before, but maybe Corey Smith can be brought in as an RB3 at some point to help preserve redshirt stats for Quentin Martin. Seems like they're looking at going back-to-back years where none of the freshmen burn redshirt status, which again is a complete 180 reversal from how things worked for Jaywan Sider through the first 4 or 5 years of his time in here at Happy Valley.
Yeah, I thought Franklin's answer was interesting from a couple of regards. Bringing up the Corey Smith factor again, I think is interesting. Kind of using those 2 guys as one. So maybe Quentin Martin gets the first half of the year, then Corey Smith gets the back half of the year. Then you have both of them for whatever the postseason looks like. We'll see what that actually looks like. Now, the one thing that he talked about is that if they need Quentin Martin to win, they will have no hesitation in burning that red shirt and putting him out there. I think that's been the common theme with a lot of these freshmen and preserving that status. He did make the point too, though, that with splitting touches between 2 running backs, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, it's pretty straightforward. But once you start trying to work in a third, then things get a little bit tricky. You have a little bit more to juggle. I think the one point that he made that I think is always worth coming back to when it comes to situations and different packages is that if you put Quentin Martin on the field, you have to take somebody off the field. And who is that? How does that change things for your offense? I think the looks that we saw from Quentin Martin against USC were both a little gadgety and a little interesting. I think one was a pretty cool like triple option type concept. But so we'll see what that actually looks like, what kind of role they have for him. We saw him back at kick returner a little bit too. But I think that's, it's one of those little subplots as we move forward and we see what this actually might look like down the road and if he can contribute.
James Franklin mentioned wanting to use his skill set in 21 personnel, which means they think he can block as well. If you're in 21 personnel, you can be a runner or a blocker there. We know they think very highly of his natural skill set as a receiver. In fact, he's a guy they believe could have been recruited to a school like Penn State to play receiver or defensive back. Very versatile prospect, but he's learned a lot since he got here in January. I mean, I guess this is something that we thought could be a luxury for the offense, Mark, but you to the point that James made, is Katron Allen or Nick Singleton exiting the field a good strategy for your offense? And it certainly sounds like they want Quentin Martin, if they're going to go full green light, to have consistent action for him and be able to create a role and have him in mind weekly. And they're just not quite there right now where they think he's ready to play. But because they haven't determined that green light status, it doesn't sound like they're actively trying to find spots in the game to utilize him. And we know they view him as a, potentially versatile weapon, even at this stage of his career.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't take too much reading between the lines. What was Franklin saying today? And as we tape this, it's Monday. He's basically saying if one of his two key guys gets hurt, knock on wood, you hope they don't. He didn't come out and say it in as many words, but if you read between the lines, the only way that Quinn Martin's not going to redshirt is if one of those guys gets banged up and his role increases, because they're not going to take one of those two guys off the field and give them fewer snaps. That's not just going to happen. And I don't care even if you do run 21 personnel, you're better off running those two guys. Not a knock on Quinn Martin at all. I mean, I think he's got a really big upside. Versatile, can block, we can do things in the passing game, but you have two guys who are likely going to be pretty high NFL draft picks next year. You're not going to waste that. So I think what he's basically saying is that kid's not really going to come out of a red shirt unless they absolutely need him. And you hope for their sake and for the health of everybody that they don't need him.
I think it's a trickier stance now with 3 game appearances than if he hadn't played against USC, because now you're in a spot where Nick or Katron, they got to go to the locker room to go to the bathroom or something like that, or right. they got to change a cleat on the sideline. Well, when you got to get to your personnel and the running back that needs to come in isn't momentarily available, it takes a play or two. It takes one play for Quentin Martin to reach that 4 games, and then the next time he's in, he's burning red shirt. So we'll see how they can manage it. I think it could be ultimately a bit of a tall task for them, but if they can get to the end of the season and they don't burn red shirt, I guess that's good news for Nick and Katron's health, and maybe what you're getting down to Corey Smith if he's able to get involved. The one more note to get to from the press conference, and Tyler Warren is going to be discussed a lot moving forward. But Daniel, you had a question for James toward the tail end of the press conference on Monday afternoon regarding Warren's versatility and essentially that Penn State was able to get a player who can do a lot more beyond the tight end role, although they had tight end in mind for him. What did you make of the answer from James?
I thought it was really thorough, excuse me, and pretty interesting. I tried to frame it as when you're recruiting someone like Tyler Warren and the type of background he has as a high school quarterback, do you envision using him how you are now down the road, or do you really silo it off that like viewing him as a tight end? And Franklin gave a lot of insight, I thought, into they like to recruit guys who can do a lot of different things and who are versatile on their high school teams. But then he talked about Warren's football IQ, and that it's one thing to say that we have a guy that has a skill set that we want to utilize in unique ways, but it's another thing to have someone who can actually do those things. And that's where Warren's versatility really, comes in, where he's handed the ball off before. He's been involved in a zone read. So, for example, Franklin said that, it's not just eye candy when he's back there and you have the running back going in motion, or he puts the ball in the running back's belly, that Warren can actually read the play and can keep or hand it off. We've seen him throw twice. He said that Warren knows how to take a snap under center, which we saw in that little bit of a subterfuge against USC with the quarterback sneak on 3rd and short. So, yeah, I thought that was an interesting framing of things, where it's not just the fact that he physically can do these things; it's the little details and everything like that. Because I mean, if you think about it, if you put him back there and he fumbles an exchange with Nick Singleton, or he airmails a pass, or fumbles a snap, I mean, we're crushing them on Saturday night and Monday morning. Like, why did you take the ball out of the quarterback's hands, et cetera. So I thought that was a kind of a different perspective, I think, on what Warren is doing and how he's doing it, that we hadn't quite gotten yet this season.
We spent some time on Warren last episode too, because we spent some time with Andy Kotelnicki during the bye week, breaking down offensive progress, some of the things that have stood out to him from an individual development. A lot more on that at Lions247.com from last week, and a lot more on that on our last episode of this podcast, which dropped on Thursday. But we're going to shift gears, as I promised last Thursday, and focus a little bit on what Tom Allen had to tell us about his defense. Like Kotelnicki, he's 6 games onto the job as a coordinator here at Penn State. Unlike Kotelnicki, he's got a lot more history in the Big Ten. The last 7 seasons, head coach at Indiana. They're having a lot of success this year. But different subject here with Tom Allen, Mark. And something we discussed with him were the defensive linemen. Zane Durant and Abdul Carter both came up specifically. He discussed his desire to continue to create that confusion for opponents with Abdul Carter. And James Franklin has mentioned this before, as he's starting to really find his momentum, become more productive at a new position, just lining him up in different spots on top of the guard, on top of the center, standing up, spying the quarterback. They want him to be unpredictable. And Tom Allen essentially echoed all that stuff. And we'll have more on Abdul Carter a little later. But I thought his commentary on Zane Durant really stood out because Zane Durant has been noted by many as a really key plus for this defense compared to recent seasons. James Franklin talked about him being the most disruptive presence in the interior for this defense in some time. And Tom Allen used some interesting descriptions here. He called him an alpha male for this defense, a guy that people can turn to. And because he's so consistent, because he's so productive, he said his twitch and explosion at his size, combined with his best quality, which is his motor, according to Tom Allen, is really creating difficulties for opposing schemes. And he's saying that he has really opened some things up for the other players off the edge as well, which is something we've discussed in the past. What do you think about Tom Allen and some of the effusive praise he put towards Zane Durant, and then also some of the kind of yet to be determined part of Abdul Carter's role within this defense?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. We've been saying for the last several weeks how even though Zane Durant isn't posting gigantic numbers, you can see your eyes tell you what's going on down on the field when they're having to double team him all the time, or when he's getting through and forcing a running back to help chip him and those kind of things. That's opening up other opportunities for other players. The whole thing about the fast twitch and quickness and that stuff, that's what sets that kid apart. I mean, he's not the biggest guy, but we've seen in the NFL that these fast twitch muscle guys can really be disruptive as defensive linemen. And I think he's trending kind of in that direction. So, yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about unsung heroes on this team, I would say that Zane Durant is really one of the guys up at the top of that list. And with respect to Abdul, you mentioned it, but there was like a getting comfortable couple games there, and the stats just weren't coming. But remember what James Franklin told us back at the beginning of the year, that even though the stats weren't quite there, that he was forcing opponents to pay attention to him. Well, now opponents are paying attention to him, and the stats are coming. I mean, so he's helping other guys, and yet he's doing really well himself, and that's the mark of an elite player. So how much better can he get? I think you have to look at this as, here's a guy who's 6 games in, and you mentioned it, Tyler. I think after 2 games, he had, was it like 1 tackle for loss or something like that? And here he is at 9.5. How much more growth potential is there? And now that Tom Allen's had a chance to take a step back during the bye week, what do we know about Tom Allen? He loves to sink himself into film study. And you can only do so much of that during the course of the regular season when you have game. I think this bye week is going to give him an opportunity to figure out even more new and creative ways to use Abdul Carter. So both those guys, I think both of those guys have been terrific. And I think Denai Dennis Sutton is being overlooked a little bit too, even though he may be benefiting from some of that extra. But I think he's drawing some attention as well because he's just a big physical DN. So between the 3 of them, just a great trio up there up front.
Yeah, Tom Allen did go out of his way to note that he feels like Denai is getting the kind of respect they'd hope he would command from opposing offenses. And when you've got guys on both sides of the edge or both edges, and you've got someone in the interior, and you've got to attribute a little more preparation and game day efforts and investments towards stopping them, it starts to stretch you thin. It's sticking with the defensive pass rush because Zane Durant is already set a career high with 2.5 sacks. You've got Abdul Carter only a half sack shy of where he was the entire season last year as a first-team All Big Ten linebacker. But we heard a specific question go to Tom Allen, Daniel, and saying, how much does that role of sacks play in the pass rush? Because Penn State, through 6 matchups at least, they were ranked 9th among all Big Ten programs with 14 total sacks. Abdul Carter had the team's only sack against USC. That was a USC offensive line that was kind of pinned as one, giving up a lot of pressure over the course of the season. Didn't really get after Miller Moss extensively or consistently, I would say, over the course of the afternoon. Toward the tail end, they did. What do you think about Tom Allen's commentary about their pass rush, where he said, we are making opponents feel us, and it's not always about that number in the stat sheet? But I know that you've been a big proponent that sack counts do ultimately matter because it means you're getting home. So how are you going to marry your personal perspective and where Tom Allen is kind of shedding light on this team and their ability to get after the quarterback?
Yeah, I think his framing is definitely fair, and it makes a lot of sense because when you're watching the games, you see Abdul Carter get through, and you see the quarterback get flushed and get forced into maybe throwing the ball early or holding the ball a little bit longer and having to scramble. I mean, you see a tangible effect on everything. And, in certain situations, if it's like a 3rd and 11 and you get that throwaway, that's great. Like that's what you wanted to accomplish on the play. I still think that, getting a ton of sacks and getting that quarterback on the ground, it changes things. I know Mark was watching the Eagles yesterday and probably saw how many times they got Daniel Jones on the ground and what that does to the tone of a game and maybe a little bit more of the intangible part of things, even though it's also incredibly tangible what is happening there. And I think there are going to be games where you just need to get the quarterback on the ground, that you are going to need a sack to push someone out of field goal range. You're going to need, to get through and get to the quarterback in a big spot to just make things more difficult as the season goes on. And so, I think that, Tom Allen brought up holding, he said they're still playing really good defense. USC was 2 for 11 on 3rd down, and he feels like they're harassing quarterbacks. The quarterbacks know they're coming. I think that it's obvious when you look at how different offensive lines are playing these Penn State pass rushers, that they know and they're well aware, and they're forcing these teams to adjust. But I think that you get to a certain point in a game where you want to get that quarterback on the ground. You need that big time negative play. And we'll see if Penn State can make that happen on a consistent basis.
Penn State was over 25 pressures in both the UCLA and Illinois games to start out Big Ten play. 14 pressures credited to Penn State on the road at USC. We'll see how they come out the gates against Wisconsin. And when you look at this pass rush and you look at it across the board, this defense, you wonder, is the thin situation at linebacker going to become a bigger issue for them? And it's not as thin as it's been at times because you have Dom DeLuca back available on the field, although he hasn't played to the extent we saw early in the season now that he's wearing a cast on his right hand, wrist, and thumb. But Mark, it's been Tony Rojas and Kobe King doing the very heavy lifting at linebacker. And Tom Allen said it a couple times during our conversation with him last week in saying that they need to get more depth from this linebacker position. He mentioned a bunch of the names that we've mentioned on the show: Tamir Robinsons, Dakari Nelsons. I don't think he brought up Anthony Specca. We've done that, the freshman. But it's really been Tyler Elsdon on a 6-game sample size has been their most consistently available and consistently utilized linebacker beyond those primary two, Antonio Rojas and Kobe King. We didn't see Tamir Robinson or Dakari Nelson get involved on defense at USC as they really tightened things up. But this is the guy who's ultimately going to be pulling the trigger on these kind of decisions. He's the linebackers coach. He's defensive coordinator. He's telling us at midseason they need to get more out of their depth. They need these guys to play. I mean, that would lead you to believe, Mark, that there's going to be more opportunities for Tamir Robinsons and the Dakari Nelsons of the world here in Happy Valley moving forward.
Well, yeah, and James, again, as we taped this on Monday earlier today, mentioned proactively Dakari Nelson. He would be another one of those guys, fellas, that I would think the bye week had to be just, tremendous because, here's a guy who's changing positions, had never played linebacker before. And again, I can't overstate the value of being able to take a step back and take a deep breath and sit down with Tom Allen and Dan Connor and have them explain kind of what's going on. Not in the heat of a game week. So I think Dakari Nelson, the fact that James kind of proactively mentioned him, he's the guy that I would look for. And then remember, he mentioned that when they're in that Lion package, Jalen Reed is effectively playing linebacker. So that's something else that I think that goes back to Day Lane. How much more comfortable are you with him on the back end that you could move Jalen Reed up there more often? Because I don't think you're really losing anything. There was a time when it would be unthinkable to play Wisconsin with a defensive back playing linebacker, right? But that's not the case anymore. I mean, even Wisconsin's chucking the ball around, throwing the ball around. So, against just about everybody they face, I think they're going to have the luxury, if Day Lane is playing at the level he needs to play, of being able to slide Jalen Reed up into that spot. But Dakari Nelson, whenever Franklin goes out of his way to mention somebody like that without really being asked directly about him, he was asked about the linebacker position. That perks my ears up a little bit and makes me think we're going to see a little bit more of him.
This staff really sees him flourishing in his special teams role as a redshirt freshman. We'll see if that seeps into defensive player in the second half of the season. Remember, he started the Big Ten opener against Illinois, but overall been largely limited for his defensive role since making that move from safety during preseason camp. Quick note here from Tom Allen on Dejan Lane. In terms of getting him to the next step, getting him out there with more frequency. He says, number one, has to learn the defense inside and out. And he also mentioned needs to learn how to study and prepare. A lot of focus on that with Poindexter right now, the safeties coach. And Tom Allen said, quote, was he forced to grow up a little faster than expected? Absolutely. But I think he definitely has the talent for it, the capacity for it. I'm excited for him, and I think he's going to be a tremendous player for us. He's going to help us win games down the stretch here. So, again, Day Lane, a guy that we came out of preseason camp, heard great things about, knew he was going to be a special teams asset, knew he was going to be a depth piece at safety, starting to evolve more as a vocal point for a guy who could determine whether they can really maximize this defense the way they want to down the stretch of Big Ten play. We heard a lot of good things in the cornerback room as well from Tom Allen, very complimentary of A.J. Harris, the sophomore transfer from Georgia, of his own homegrown sophomore, and Zion Tracy, said he's playing his best ball right now, Elliott Washington. But he says the cornerback room has really proven to be a strong piece of what they look to do. And he said going back to when he showed up on campus last December, it's really evolved in his mind. And, of course, since then they've added some transfer pieces. They've had some guys grow up a little bit in that room. But get the full breakdown from Tom Allen over at Lions247.com. We've got a complete breakdown of his Q&A with some context notes in there as well. Let's finish with some mid-season topical discussions here, because we had our mid-season roundtables go out on Lions247.com the last several days as part of this bye week experience. I know the bye week is over, but we wanted to bring it to the podcast format a little bit. Mark, as usual, was the ringleader in collecting the answers for these, and Daniel had the first answer. And the first question that Mark sent our way was MVP at 6-0 for Penn State, and he took a really important player off the table. No Tyler Warren, taking the most obvious selection off the table for us after that dominant performance against USC. So with that in mind, Daniel, you had the first pick. Tell us what you did.
I went with Nick Singleton. I really tried to keep the recency bias out of things, where we didn't see Nick Singleton against UCLA, and then he did not do much in that win at USC, aside from catch the game-tying touchdown late in the fourth quarter. But I think you look at what Singleton did during those first 4 games of the year and just how dynamic he was, and it just really felt like he changed the complexion of this offense a little bit. Because coming into the year, we were looking, where are the home runs going to come from? And we knew that Singleton had that in him. We had not seen that from the passing game really in the past. And so, Singleton coming out and having 40-yard touchdown runs in the first 2 games of the year, I think really set the tone for what this offense can be. We heard from players that they could tell that defenses started have to play them differently when Singleton and Kaytron Allen are running like that. And so I think that Nick Singleton is a real catalyst for what this offense wants to do when it's playing at its highest level. And I think that if he's not performing at this level, maybe Drew Aller isn't performing at the level he is at this point.
And that's my pick for MVP here. I went with Drew Aller. And as I noted at Lions247.com, I truly would have really considered Drew with Tyler Warren even being available. I know that's difficult to swallow, but I think Drew Aller has been exactly kind of what you had hoped to see. And I know that recency plays a big role in this, like Daniel said, because we just saw really the best of him on the road at USC, overcoming a couple interceptions and being able to get this team back home with the victory with some of his really strong performance down the stretch. But I think overall body of work, his completion percentage is up from 60% last year. It's 71% right now. You tasked him with throwing the ball 22 more times than what his average was on the season against USC, and he was still at 70% completion. His distribution of the ball has been outstanding. Big step forward from last year, giving a lot of things to think about for opposing teams. And I just think that he's been able to still avoid getting reckless with the ball. I know we saw a couple of bad passes with you at USC, but taking more risks without being clearly more reckless with the ball. I think that's a difficult thing to balance, and overall he's done a really good job with it. And I'll just note that we've heard about his improved athleticism and running and how that might look for Penn State. I think we've seen how it looks for Penn State. He's bought him some time to make some pretty important throws for them through 6 games, and he's getting it done with his feet a little bit. He's got 11 runs on the year right now of 10 yards or more. And I think he had 11 of them last year. He's got 8 already this year. So 11 runs of 10 plus yards from the quarterback position for this Penn State team. I think that goes a long way. And I also think his demeanor, when we talk about the value, there was a big value in that when we saw game 1. There was even greater value when we saw it late in game 6. And I think if that continues, he's going to have a lot of those value categories filled up for this team as they work their way through the regular season. But that's where my head was at it. Mark, I know you took things in a defensive direction because we opened it up to both sides of the ball for MVP.
Yeah, we just didn't have enough time to do offense, defense, and everything else we wanted to get to. And I thought the defense really needed to be represented given how well they've played overall. And I'm going to go back to somebody we were talking about earlier in Abdul Carter. And I have the numbers here now. Through 2 games, he had 8 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, no sacks. And people were wondering, what's wrong with Abdul Carter? Well, he just had to get comfortable at his new position. In the last 4 games, 3 of them against Big Ten competition, 8.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 3 quarterback hurries, 3 pass breakups, and a forced fumble. And he probably should have had 2 interceptions, at least 1. I mean, one of them may have been a little bit trickier, but against USC, he could catch that ball. So the word that Franklin has been using since the beginning of the year is disruptive. So even when he wasn't getting those stats up there, opponents were holding him, they're double teaming him, they're doing all these different things, and it's opening up opportunities for other people. And then again, I think what makes you an elite player is when you're getting all this extra attention and now the numbers are coming. So to me, a lot of ways you could have gone on that defense. Zane Durant could have been a guy. Jalen Reed could have been a guy for sure because he's been playing outstanding football. But I just think Abdul Carter, with his kind of body of work and in the way he's making people around him better, is my guy.
Most improved player category, I had the first pick here. I mean, this is one I think you could really throw Drew Aller's name in and feel confident in the pick. But in order not to double it up, I went with Omari Evans. Of late, he has not been the same field stretching presence that we saw maybe earlier in the season, but just know that presence is still part of it. He's pacing about 4th, he is pacing 4th and pretty definitively at wide receiver behind Wallace and Fleming and Clifford. But we know what the impact has looked like. He's averaging over 20 yards per catch, 21.5. Mark, you noted that going into last weekend, if he had one more catch on his resume, I think he was at 11 catches through 6 games. Yeah. That would have been the number 1 mark across college football. And so you think about what he did last year through those 10 games with Mike Yurcich as OC, didn't have anything more than a 5-yard grab. Now he is somebody that you definitively, if you're a defensive coordinator, you have to respect when he's out in the field. And Drew Aller, even when he's looking in his direction and not converting long bombs, he's gotten a couple key penalties that have kept drives alive, giving them a chance to go down the field and score more points. So I think ultimately, when a guy has 94 yards for his previous career high, and he's at midseason with almost 250 career yards, and that's only on 11 catches, makes my life a little bit easier in trying to figure out an answer for this one. And Mark, where did you go with your most improved player?
Yeah, I expected Vega Ioane to be good this year, but I didn't expect him to be this good. I mean, right now he's trending as a first-team All Big Ten pick, and if that holds up, He'll be the first interior offensive lineman for Penn State to win first team All Big Ten honors since John Urschel in 2013. James Franklin has not had an interior lineman win offensive or first team All Big Ten. You post the Pro Football Focus numbers, Tyler, and I was shocked. I mean, when you see the top 3 guys for Penn State, you figure, who are they going to be, right? I mean, it's who everybody assumed it was going to be: Aller, Singleton, and Tyler Warren. And then coming in at number 4 is Venga. And then you look at the percentage of snaps. I think he's played more snaps than anybody else on the team, whether he's playing guard or whether he's the second team center, which we suspected, and we ultimately found out that he was when they kept him in there with the second team. So just the level that he's playing with or playing at, and then the enthusiasm he's kind of generated among fans for what offensive linemen can do. I know it may sound goofy, but that one play where he goes in motion and wipes out the guy from Illinois, I mean, that's really something that, I think really smart fans could just absolutely respect what he did. And you got the sense in the stadium, it was like, whoa. So for an offensive lineman to be able to do that, or to be able to go and play fullback, I mean, this guy is a legit 350 pounds. And he runs well enough that they're able to do that stuff with him. So I thought he was going to be good this year, but I thought he might be a year or 2 off from being that all Big Ten caliber. I think he's all Big Ten caliber right now. And I think if he stays healthy, you're going to see him get there.
He does lead the team in total snaps, and more than a dozen of them have taken place in the slot, out wide, or in the backfield. So it's been fun to follow.
Great.
Daniel, what do you got for us?
Yeah, Mark and Tyler both went with guys who have seen their roles expand pretty dramatically in Omari Evans' case this year. I went with someone who was a starter last year, but who has leveled up. We talked about him earlier, Zane Durant at defensive tackle. Through 6 games, he has equaled the number of tackles for loss with 6 and exceeded his sack total from 13 games last year. He was a full-time starter last year, but we've really seen him level up a notch, and we've seen what that means. He's the highest graded for however much stock you want to put in PFF. He is the highest graded defender. He's the highest graded run defender. He's the number 4 graded pass rusher with a minimum of 100 snaps. He has more total pressures this year than he did last year. I just think that he has been very disruptive this year. I think we've seen sort of the flashes of it over the past 2 years. I mean, he's someone who came in and burned his red shirt and then got a starting job as a sophomore last year, but he's really leveled it up a notch. And I think looking at the snap counts from that USC game were instructive too, because we talk about defensive tackle as being one of the deepest positions on the team and where you can rotate through. And Penn State really kept it short at that spot in that game with Durant as the headliner with Devon J. Thomas. So I think he's just doing a lot of really nice things. We heard what Tom Allen said about him. We talked about that a little earlier. And I think that he is just, the era has really been up for him all season long.
Penn State has a perfect record. They are not perfect. And with that, we go to our biggest questions at midseason. And Mark, we begin with you.
Slow starts. I know James Franklin kind of poo-pooed that today. But I don't know. I mean, I look at this team and you see somebody who's behind 17-3 and 20-6 against USC, 17-7 and 24-17 in the second half the second quarter against Bowling Green. This is a team that hasn't been playing well to start games, and I think they really have to get that together, because if you end up falling into that sort of hole against Ohio State, you're going to be in some significant trouble. The good news is they've been playing exceptionally well in the second half. So while they've given up 60 first half points, which may not seem a lot, but when you compare it to what they've done in the second half, third quarter, they've outscored their opponents 59-3, second half 107-27. So they're playing at a different level in the second half. And I'm not saying you have to play at that super duper high level the entire game, because there's going to be ebbs and flows, but they just have to get more balance, I think, in what they're be able to do between that first and second half. Because again, if you fall into that sort of hole against some of these better teams that are coming up, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble.
Daniel, you had the same question, the second pick there.
Yeah, erasing a 2-touchdown deficit against USC after a slow start doesn't look as special anymore after what some of our alma maters have done recently. But I put, can Penn State avoid an uncharacteristic stumble during the back half of the season? Penn State's been really good these past 2.5 years of avoiding the clunker, I guess you would call it. They're 27-5. 4 of those losses are to Michigan and Ohio State, the others to Ole Miss in a bowl game that is one of those results that, it still counts, but, with everything surrounding it in the context of the program, you kind of throw it out. So Penn State has won a lot of these games, and they've won most of them handily over these past couple of years. There's just haven't been, very many close games. I think the Indiana game last year was really the one that came down to the wire before you had Bowling Green and USC this year. So I think that Penn State has done a good job avoiding that, but it's something that's always in the back of your mind when you talk about the schedule that's coming up. You've got some tricky spots at Wisconsin, at Purdue, at Minnesota. I think Penn State is bigger than all of those teams, but things can get weird. James Franklin has talked about not wanting to have that stumble or that setback in order for his team to grow. And so I think this is where coaching really comes in terms of, if you do happen to lose one to Ohio State, you don't let it beat you twice. You don't let the bye week beat you. You just kind of avoid weird things that have happened maybe earlier in James Franklin's tenure at Penn State. So I think for me, this team 6-0, there are questions and it's hard to find too many of them, but I think in the big picture, this was one that stood out to me.
I'm going to go tying in a little bit of what Mark said regarding the slow starts, but overall, is this a good defense or a great defense? And I think that's a question that we're all still wondering after seeing a great defense last year before a lot of the opt-outs kind of changed the complexion of what that unit looked like in the postseason. But thus far we knew Tom Allen was going to lose a lot of key pieces from last year's team to the NFL. That did happen. We didn't know that KJ Winston was going to be on the sideline before Big Ten play, well before Big Ten play, and not available because he was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week after Game 1. He's a guy that a lot of us viewed as maybe that first round defensive back finally from Penn State. But here we are. There's been Jalen Reed not getting to play as much of that line role. There's been trying to get Dejon Lane up to speed at safety alongside Zakee Wheatley. And I think there's still some slight concern at linebacker, where if you, for whatever reason, need to dip below Kobe King and Tony Rojas and somebody's got to play 60% plus snaps, I don't know who that's going to be, and I don't know how they're going to perform. And we'll see if King and Rojas can continue what they're doing. But it's a physical season, it's a demanding season, and there's 6 games left before you even get to the postseason. So I think that's a key thing. And just ultimately, you're looking at a team that where they were going into last weekend, 3rd among Big Ten teams in points allowed, 14.5. 4th in yards allowed, about 262 yards per game. 9th in total sacks with 14 of those. I think overall you're very pleased with the overall work, but you kind of wonder, is there another dominant step where Penn State can take? And to me, that involves erasing those early issues, the stumbling out of the gates. Mark went over some of the scoring that's occurred. Bowling Green, Illinois, each scored touchdowns on their opening possession. UCLA went deep down into their territory before going for it on 4th down and not getting points. We saw USC get a 75-yard touchdown its second series while getting 20 points in the first half. And so to me, if that happens against Ohio State, we already know that's going to put yourself in a very difficult position. But it's some of those other games where you look at maybe stumbling blocks like Daniel referenced, where an early start, especially on the road in November perhaps, or even this Saturday, just you don't want to create too many holes for yourself to have to climb out of. So I think overall, body of work, is this defense great? Is it good? Could ultimately determine how many games this team plays into December, maybe beyond. And let's go over to another topic we had, which was bold prediction. Daniel, how bold do you want to get?
Let's call the shot. Let's say Penn State beats Ohio State on November 2nd at Beaver Stadium. I think that this Penn State team, I think the big thing for me is they've shown that they can be explosive. They showed that they could come back against USC. They've shown that if they get into sort of a track meet like that USC game felt like at a couple points, that they can hang. I think that the talent level on that Ohio State roster is really, really impressive. on both sides of the ball. You look at what they've done both on the recruiting trail and in the portal. But I think that with where Penn State is and how they're playing, this is a year where I think the Nittany Lions can get it done. A big thing too, Drew Aller in these moments last year really shrank, but against USC, fourth quarter, things weren't really going well for him for much of the day, but he was able to kick it into gear and lead a game-tying fourth quarter drive. I think seeing that from him on the road, not necessarily in the most hostile environment, but it did get loud at the Coliseum, and he kept his composure and got it done. So, I feel a lot better about Drew Aller if you're in one of these games where the difference could be your 5-star quarterback making 5-star quarterback throws. And then Penn State has just collected some really good talent on its defense, where this is where Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton, those types of players need to step up. Jalen Reed, AJ Harris. This is where they make big plays. So I think that things are set up nicely for Penn State right now. Home game. I know it's noon. A lot of people have thoughts on that, but it should still be a good environment. Got to take care of business at Wisconsin first.
7 straight losses against Ohio State. I've got one prediction, player specific here. I think Abdul Carter, we spent a lot of time talking about him on this episode. I think he's going to finish the regular season with at least 12 sacks for this bold prediction. That would mean 8 sacks over the course of the next 6 games after he collected 4 in the first 6 matchups. But he is definitely gaining momentum. I think he's been playing at a different competitive level during conference play since they got into that Illinois a few weeks ago. And that's been reflected. He was the Big Ten Player of the Week after the Illinois matchup. He had some really key disruptive moments against UCLA. And then you could argue that he was the most impactful defender on the field against USC in his complete body of work. And so I think a dozen sacks on the season, not only would that put him in rarefied territory of Penn State, I believe the number is 5 players in Penn State history have gotten to 12 sacks in a season, and that's including some bowl sacks, I'm sure, along the way. But I think with Carter, it would also really validate what you're seeing right now in the mock draft world, where he's being projected in the top 10s. ESPN had him in a top 3 last week. I know Tom Allen has more plans, more wrinkles to utilize him. I think that's going to pay off. And I think his second half and some of the dominant moments is going to really be a major storyline that we track. So there's my bold prediction. And you got one program-wide from Daniel, and now you're going to get one on the coaching staff from Mark.
Yeah, I'm going a little bolder as well. Some of us are bolder than others. I'm going to go Andy Kotelnicki winning the Broyles Award, which I didn't even know what it was, but it goes to the nation's top assistant coach. No Penn State coach has ever won that, which is kind of amazing to me when you think, especially Joe Moorhead, the job he did a few years ago. But listen, you look at what Kotelnicki's done, and whether it's the entire team, I won't go through all the stats that I listed, but they're averaging about 100 yards per game more, which is crazy. Yards per play have gone up 5.2 to 7.2. I mean, that is massive when you factor in over the course of how many plays are run during the season. Aller, 10.4 yards per completion last year under Mike Yurcich, 10.2 yards per attempt. I mean, this year, Singleton's numbers are way up, 2.9 yards per carry. Amari Evans, you touched on. Tyler Warren, 27 catches for 273 yards in 11 games under Yurcich last year, 40 catches, 513 games in 6 games this year. You also factor in who the Penn State offense lost. 3 offensive linemen drafted to the NFL, including the number 11 overall pick. Theo Johnson, who's now starting for the hapless Giants, and Keandre Lambert-Smith, who is now the leading receiver for Auburn. And then if you look at it a different way and you go and you see what's happened at Kansas, it's been crazy. Before they ended up beating Houston this week, 42-14, they had lost 5 straight. Their numbers across the board offensively were all down. So any way that you kind of look at this guy has had an unbelievable impact on Penn State. But obviously losing him has had an incredible impact negatively on Kansas. So I think the job he's doing, if he can keep doing it, it's going to put him right in position to be that top assistant coach in the nation. First time Penn State coach wins it.
Yeah, certainly validated the hype thus far through 6 games. We'll see if that carries over. Let's finish here. We're going a little extra long on this episode, but we wanted to make sure we brought a bunch of bye week content that we had bottled up to you before we fully focus on Wisconsin. And our last topic for the midseason roundtables was the most concerning matchup that lies ahead. We know Ohio State is the most concerning. They're coming to town for what is probably going to be a top 5 contest in just a couple of weeks. So we're taking, like we did with the MVP, one option off the table. You can't say Ohio State here. And this was my pick for the first one. And I went with the one staring them directly ahead. This is the trip to Madison, Wisconsin this weekend. Not only are you going to get an environment that's really strong, ask that 2021 squad. They started their season on the road to Madison. It was a dogfight down to the end, came away with a late takeaway to seal the victory there. But you throw in the 7:30 kickoff time. You now factor in this is a Wisconsin team that has won 3 games in a row. I think that their fans and overall that community, maybe after a couple of losses to USC and Alabama at 2-2, win was out of the sails. But now at 5-2, with the number 3 team in the nation coming to town, this is going to be very much viewed as a potential turning point moment for Luke Fickell and his coaching staff, and a major opportunity on the table for them in a national spotlight. So I think the psychological test is also in play. I think there's a lot riding on Wisconsin's side that makes this a tough one. But to me, you're coming off a bye week. You're coming off a bye week that followed one of the most thrilling victories of James Franklin's time here. And so psychologically, can Penn State make those slow starts a thing of the past on the road in Madison? And can they really avoid looking past this matchup? Because we all know how big the Ohio State game is. It's in Beaver Stadium. So I think there's a tricky nature to this. It's Penn State not looking behind itself and patting itself on the back for where it is, but also not looking too far down the line into the next week where Ohio State is coming to town, and that one is going to have a lot riding on it. So there's my pick, and Mark, you had the next one.
Yeah, we initially were going to allow repeats, and I made an executive decision of impacting me the most not to do repeats because it seems stupid. We never do repeats, so let's not do them here. I went with Washington, and here's why. Number one, you have a really good coach in Fitch, and you have Will Rogers, a quarterback who's performed in massive stadiums. But I think the key to this game is going to be Penn State, Ohio State. If Penn State beats Ohio State, you could have a letdown. If Penn State loses to Ohio State, I think you could be in a position where it's one game beats you twice. So that's what I'm going with. I was going to go, if I had to pick one, it would be Wisconsin. Don't think I could go with the boat rowers out at Minnesota. So I would end up going with Washington, even though if you look at their scores, losing at Rutgers don't look like the most formidable opponent, but this is more about Penn State and where it is psychologically coming out of the Ohio State game.
Yeah, Washington also had a bye week. Their most recent appearance was a rough loss at Iowa. I know that we are going to get a little boat rowing here from Daniel to finish off the roundtables, and you got that trip to Minneapolis in November circled.
November 23rd in Minneapolis. My biggest concern outside Ohio State, Minnesota, not just because of what's happened before with Penn State in a big spot headed to the upper Midwest, but yeah, I just think that this Minnesota team has won ugly, lost ugly, done a lot of things ugly this year. And late November, who knows what the weather is going to be like in Minneapolis. You could be a team that is 10-0 and looking towards the finish line after overcoming some of these other humps earlier in the month. It's just a game that stands out to me a little bit as a potentially tricky spot. At the beginning of the year, I thought that the Purdue trip would be a little bit tricky, but that's a program that is really in disarray. But I think having back-to-back road games in November, going to West Lafayette and Minneapolis in back-to-back weeks, it's just not really an appealing thing. I think this is where you're going to need that coaching to come through, have these guys focused, avoid any letdowns, look aheads, what have you, and be able to be ready for what could be just an ugly 21-18, 17-16, 16-10 type game against Minnesota.
All right. Well, we'll get to those when we get to them. But obviously, we've got the Wisconsin matchup to focus on this week. We're going to do that a lot more with episode number 2. We'll have a Badgers insider on to break down Penn State's next opponent. We'll get the latest from the recruiting trail with Tyler Calvaruso. Penn State was pretty busy during the bye week. Got a lot to talk about there as well. For now, Mark and Daniel, myself, Tyler Donahue, going to step aside. Follow our coverage at Lions247.com. We're back on the practice field Wednesday. We're going to hear from several Penn State players on Tuesday. So plenty of game week commentary and context coming your way over at the website and more on this podcast. These guys will be back on Thursday to give our predictions and key storylines for the Wisconsin-Penn State matchup. For now, stepping aside, this has been the Lions247 Podcast.